This will be a continuation of the lecture for week 4 regarding chapter 3 in the Barnett textbook on child neglect and psychological maltreatment. This is part 2, and we're going to be talking about psychological maltreatment or emotional abuse, as it's called sometimes, in this particular segment. Most believe that psychological maltreatment should be based upon the behavior of the parent and not the effects those behaviors produce. This is a particularly difficult area for child protection workers in this state and other states as well, because psychological maltreatment is something that's pretty difficult to demonstrate. You can't really put your finger on it, and while as an individual you may see signs of things that you believe demonstrate psychological maltreatment, another individual, even a trained practitioner, might look at it and explain it differently. So for the purposes of bringing cases to court, psychological maltreatment, emotional abuse, mental injury is what we refer to in Alaska statutes. It's a very, very difficult thing to bring to court, and you have to bring in experts that testify as to particular nature of the problem. That might not be the issue if the focus wasn't upon the effects on the child, but rather simply looked at the behavior of the parent and kept the focus on that. And there wouldn't be a need for any kind of debate about whether or not a child was harmed. The definition of psychological maltreatment as put forward in the text indicates it's a repeated pattern of caregiver behavior that conveys to children that they are worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, or only of value in meeting another's needs. Now, this is the definition advanced by the American Professional Society on Abuse of Children in 1995, and it's a pretty good definition, but I believe only part of psychological maltreatment, because this doesn't encompass children being exposed to violence in the home. And, Alaska statutes and many statutes around the United States, in fact, also provide for child protection workers to intervene in situations where children are exposed to domestic violence repeatedly in their homes. So the authors of the textbook believe, and I have to say I concur, that really the focus, as far as defining psychological maltreatment, the focus of the definition should be on the child outcomes, mental injury, psychological problems, or should it be on parental behaviors? Actually, this isn't a conclusion. It's a kind of a debate, I guess, on whether it should be on child outcomes based on the parental behaviors, such as rejecting, terrorizing the child, those things, or the nature of the parent-child interactions, where the child needs interaction, the parent doesn't give it, something like that. Really, again, this is another issue about definitions, and how it's defined is something we'll see later on is important in the legal process. There are some prevalence data regarding psychological maltreatment, but it is difficult to capture because the fact that the definition is really kind of confusing. Psychological maltreatment, mental injury, is the least commonly reported form of reported and substantiated child maltreatment. And I would say that's also the case, as we talked about neglect being the most frequently reported and how that was reflected in my local log of reports. I would also say that that's the case for mental injury here, that it is the smallest amount of reports that come into our office, although it is oftentimes intertwined with many other types of complaints. It is assumed to be the most common type of maltreatment. We believe really that in fact physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect all have elements of psychological maltreatment in them, and so even though it's considered to be encompassed in all those other subtypes of child maltreatment, nonetheless it's just not very frequently reported. And one study in 2001 concluded that about a third of children in the United States experience psychological maltreatment. So when a parent continually puts down a child, terrorizes the child, whatever, says nasty, terrible things to a child repeatedly over a period of time, individuals begin to perceive themselves. I mean, this is sort of a sociological tenet, that we begin to perceive ourselves as others see us. And so when you have that persistent kind of feedback given to you, you begin to believe this about yourself. And this is the most damaging short-term impact of psychological maltreatment. If you're told over and over again that you're worthless, stupid, unlovable, you have to come to believe it eventually. Now, we're not talking about instances where, if a parent with troubling children or adolescents, you know that kids sometimes have a way of pushing a button in you, or you find some emotions inside of you never even knew existed before, with just the frustration sometimes with children in child rearing and things. And sometimes you say things to your kids that later on you shouldn't have said and you regret. You may even go back and apologize for it, maybe not, depends on your own kind of constitution about those things. But we're not talking about these things that happen once or twice here, but really we're talking about a pattern that goes on continually and just wears down the child. Long-term effects of psychological maltreatment, it is really the strongest predictor of long-term impacts on psychological functioning, and there you see the number of different kinds of problems that arise from this, including personality disorders like borderline personality disorders, somatic concerns, anxiety, depression. And this is one of those things we were talking about how we adapt certain behaviors to cope with our childhood issues, and eventually we kind of develop this style of functioning that we carry into our adult years when we really don't need those styles anymore, but we that's how we have come to relate to the world. And so sometimes children who've been psychologically abused will be over accommodating as adults, or they will isolate themselves socially or become domineering and controlling themselves to kind of fix that in their adult years. Really maladaptive behaviors develop in the adult years as a result of these things, if there's not intervention, and there is the possibility of intervention and a number of different ways that these problems can be resolved. But if they're not resolved, this is the kinds of thing that can happen. And this is, again, it's a topic that we're going to be talking about from time to time throughout the semester, and we'll spend a lot more time in this later. But sort of like last week, we were talking about researchers and practitioners and how the two of them always didn't hold hands very well together in approaching the topic of family violence. And likewise, domestic violence and child abuse sometimes are kind of seen as different fields. And it's very interesting to me that in Alaska, Governor Parnell a few years ago took a stand against violence in families, and it's called Choose Respect, and his Choose Respect campaign focuses upon law enforcement and domestic violence, doesn't mention child abuse, which I'm not clear on the reason for that. I don't know if he just assumes child abuse is a subset of domestic violence, or if he doesn't really see it connected into the problem of family violence. But clearly, research has shown that that the children suffer psychological maltreatment not only directly but also indirectly from exposure to violence between others. Children who observe their parents in violent interactions are harmed by that violence. And again, we had talked in the last segment that I talked about with neglect about how exposure to violence actually causes physical changes to the children's brain. I mean, this is what we're learning these days, and so those kinds of things are going on with those children, and they're being harmed in indirect fashion, even though nobody's laying a hand on them themselves. Domestic violence and child abuse really need to be viewed together, I think, and seen as different parts of a whole, more or less, in terms of the family violence. There is a lot of evidence that indicates that child abuse and domestic violence co-occur in many families. And it's interesting when you see prevalence data that says 18 to 67% of the families with interparental violence also have some child abuse. 18 to 67% is a pretty wide variety. That says from 1/5 to 2/3. And I don't know if that tells me a whole lot, but based upon my own experience over the years of working in the field, this is purely anecdotal, not scientific, I would have to tell you that I certainly believe that more than half of our families with child abuse have elements of domestic violence in them when the situation permits it. And this is something we really didn't know. In fact, I remember back in the 1990s that we were pulling case records and documenting the number of times that we found domestic violence in situations in families that we were investigating, as well as child abuse. And I believe that we said 60% was the figure, that 60% of our child protection cases also had elements of domestic violence involved in the complaint. Again, with interparental violence, is exposing this child an act of omission, or is it a commission? Is it neglect, or is it actually abuse of a child to have that child present in that situation? And again, I'll tell you how it's defined has has legal implications and social implications. For instance, who's accountable? If it's considered an act of omission that somebody's not protecting this child from observing this violence, well, you can hold the perpetrator responsible for that, but you can also hold the non-offending, the other victim, the adult victim, responsible as well for not leaving that perpetrator. So she probably continually exposes this child to this violence over and over again and is seen to be neglectful. You see how the definition of omission versus commission turns a victim into a perpetrator, basically. Whereas if it's seen as an act of commission, the person perpetrating the violence is the person who is also causing the harm to the child. Keeping the focus on the behavior of the adult is very helpful in this area. As far as prevalence statistics goes, there's a study. This is the first national survey on children's exposure to violence. David Finkelhor, who is, among others, is a noted scholar in the area of child abuse and neglect, was behind this particular study, I believe, and this was just a few years ago. Said that nearly 10% of the children in the United States are exposed to violence every year. The ACE study, which is 2006, and again, these are fully functioning adults. I mean, mostly fully functioning adults in the general population of workers. 13.7% of women and 11.5% of men said that they were exposed to marital violence as children. The effects on children's exposure to interparental violence. Research studies show that they have more emotional and behavioral problems that require clinical intervention than children who are not exposed to those kinds of behaviors. And there are all sorts of psychological difficulties seen later in life. As you look at this list, it looks a lot like the kinds of problems that we were talking about with the ACE study in the neglect segment. Depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, substance abuse, lack of conflict resolution skills, poor social adjustment, sometimes verbal and physical violence against their own partner and children. This is that intergenerational piece associated with this. Generally speaking, the law has failed to recognize the exposure of children in violent homes as being a problem. And again, I will tell you that it is a very, very difficult thing to bring a mental injury case or emotional abuse case into court in this state and in many states. And this is an area that I believe the legal system and the courts really need to take a serious look at in fixing, because that is a denial of a very serious problem. When psychological maltreatment increases as children get older, according to one study at least, and boys are more likely to experience psychological maltreatment than girls. But another study showed that the peak of psychological abuse is between the ages of 4 and 11 years of age, and that seems to kind of contradict that first statement in this list. And again, that's an indication that the studies really are, this is an emerging field. We really don't know. We don't have all the answers here yet. And there's a small percentage of child fatalities associated with psychological maltreatment. There are those children, that we think of as being resilient, and these are kids that seem to grow out of these terrible situations and have every excuse in the world to act out and to be sitting in prison or doing harmful things to other people, and yet somehow they are highly successful, getting advanced degrees and on and on and on, and so the question, of course, is how do those kids, what do they have? What is going for them that explains that they pull through these situations when others don't? And I know that the conventional wisdom has been over the years, and I've heard this many, many times through many different training sessions, and in fact is something that I have told students over the years, that one very significant factor in the lives of resilient children is the presence of a significant adult outside the family system. That is somebody that child can turn to, who can affirm the child for their positive qualities, and kind of help them get a balance and a perspective on the world and those kinds of things. It might be a teacher, it could be a counselor, could be the neighbor, it could be an uncle down the street, but it's somebody outside the family who is a significant adult for that child. But there are other things in this particular study says that things like child's temperament and self-esteem, also may have something to do with how they pull through these terrible situations. But other studies are showing also that children might be resilient in only one domain and not all. For instance, that child who was an abused child who goes on to get a PhD and excel as a scholar may have a very terrible family life. May be bereft of any emotional connections. Whatever. That resilience isn't necessarily across all domains. It is sometimes only in one or two domains, and so that's an important thing to keep in mind. But among those resilient children, the more recent studies are showing that there are certain kinds of influences that have helped them, and one of them is better parenting performance. Well, okay, so parents that were not as bad as some of the others. If you had a better parent, then you were more likely to be somewhat resilient. Maybe if you have one parent who's better, at least. Have a mom who has fewer mental health issues, and I think probably that has something to do with the mother being the nurturer for that child. And also less severe exposure, not exposure to violence, but not as severe as other families. So the resilience may also have to do with kind of not only the quantity but the quality of, sort of, if you will, of the violence, how terrible it was. And here are some indications of the characteristics of maltreating parents, risk factors that are really independent of anything about the children. These are just some things that parents who are maltreating parents, psychologically maltreating parents, qualities that they tend to have. And you can see here, among other things, lower parent age, single parenthood, lack of social support, poor relationships with one's own parents, that intergenerational transmission. You can see here that I think one of the conclusions that is drawn from this is early parenting. For the teenage parents among you out there that are maybe listening to this, I don't mean to say that the world is against you here or that you can't succeed or anything, but the fact is that people who have children at a younger age are more likely to maltreat their children later. There's a number of different, social factors that you may very well be aware of that do not spell positive things for the children of teen parents, and so and also being a single parent, because you don't have another parent to draw on their resources with and to share duties with and things like that. So it shows you a little bit about what are some of the supports around that individual. Has that individual as a parent had an opportunity to kind of grow up and mature as a human being as well in and of themselves before they became a parent? Some of the things that at least contribute to that. And also an interesting thing here that female parents are more often identified as perpetrators of psychological maltreatment. Again, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that female parents are the ones who are usually raising the children when there's a lot of stress in the home, if there's not two parents. And again, I would think gender bias may have something to do with that finding. Here's some of the contributing factors in child neglect and child psychological maltreatment. For instance, socioeconomically, SES, socioeconomic status. The rates of neglect are higher among families with very low income who are on unemployment and who are dependent upon social assistance. Stress, stress, stress. Each of those areas increase stress because of that. That would explain the rates of neglect being higher most likely. SES is also a stronger predictor of child neglect than any other form of maltreatment, and wouldn't you think that perhaps abuse might be one of those things that's more common, but it isn't. It is a stronger predictor of child neglect. Family structure and functioning. Mothers who have a greater number of children during their teen years or who are younger at birth of their first child have an increased risk for neglecting children. This is just what we were talking about in the last panel, I think. And younger mothers with premature or low birth weight babies are also at higher risk of neglect. There's a consistent indication of intergenerational transmission of styles of parenting. And, neglectful parents tell us that they have childhood histories of neglect and abuse themselves. Does that mean if you're neglected or abused as a child that you are doomed to repeat that into the future? Absolutely not. There are things that can be done and is done to change that, and we'll be talking about that in a moment, but I don't want you to think that this says that there's nothing that can be done, or that kids that have been abused and neglected shouldn't have kids because they're going to do the same thing themselves. The majority of those children grow up to be good parents. Neglecting parents do tend to have problems in their own lives that generate additional stress. Single parenting. Children of single parents are at greater risk for neglect. I think we just mentioned that. And fathers who are, if they're in those homes, if they are present and they're involved with their children, make a positive difference for their kids. And so having them present is one thing, having a present father who is also involved with the kids, actively involved, is a very positive thing and can make a big difference in the lives of families. Mothers with disabilities and the unique challenges they face, not the least of which is lack of funding for services. Mothers with disabled children who grow up into adulthood, they have children all their lives, and sometimes don't have anybody to come in to give them a break, and so like the existence of respite services, so that as adults they can go about taking care of other things that they need to take care of to run their lives. Those kinds of things. Funding is often very short for that. Mothers parenting in father-violent families often have custody and visitation issues that create complications for them. Fathers who parent in violent families, many fathers abusing their partners, have told interventionists that they didn't know that it harmed their children to witness it. Hard to imagine, but some of the studies are suggesting that they're ignorant of that. And there are a lot of legal difficulties that mothers run into in coping with violent fathers, not the least of which is how to protect her children while living with her own fear. And this is one of those areas that is what I would call dynamic between the women's shelters, the domestic violence workers, and CPS workers, and that is how to hold the other spouse accountable for protection of the children without re-victimizing her. And again, I say her because typically it is a female. Not impossible to do, but it is a dance. Also of note, there's a box in the textbook that would be easy to overlook, and I think should be actually part of the main chapter. This is something that we see a lot of times on a daily basis at work, and this is the problems that mothers encounter in maneuvering through the court system. It's interesting because we're used to hearing fathers saying that mothers get all the preferences of the judges in the courts, and that fathers have to pay support and don't have equal access to their children. You hear that an awful lot from men who feel closed out from their families. And yet, for those of us that work in the child protection system, we oftentimes find mothers being actually victimized by the court system all over again because of the way the case is presented and their lack of resources available to them. And as a result of that, sometimes, abusive husbands oftentimes are very good at convincing the judge and the social worker and the guardian ad litem and other people who are involved in these cases that they're the better parent, that the victim, oftentimes she's been battered and beaten so much she has psychological problems, she's in and out of psychiatric hospitals perhaps, or she can't stand on her own 2 feet, she's depressed, she can't get out of bed, whatever it might be. He looks strong and vibrant in comparison. Somehow the people in the system, police included, often fall for this and invest the care of the children with the abusive parent. And it's an interesting thing that we do see happening, and it's one of those things again that we have to really be on guard about. The mother's dilemma oftentimes is when she's being abused, does she report her husband's abuse or not? If she doesn't, the child protection system might consider her being, failing to protect her kids. If she does report it, her husband oftentimes takes her into court with a suit for parental alienation, where she's trying to turn her children against the father, and we hear that often enough in our cases as well. Mothers, oftentimes those who are economically dependent upon their husbands, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the means to hire an attorney, and there are very few systems, even through the women's shelter, there are very few systems for pro bono representation in these cases. I think the need is just so great that attorneys know they can't take it on, but there needs to be some kind of system in place for mothers in domestic violence situations, I think, to have legal representation, because they don't have the money. The fathers might, because they're usually the wage earner, and so they'll get better legal representation and prevail in court. Oftentimes, when women go to court to get temporary restraining orders against their perpetrator, they have to go back after 20 days and testify then as to why they need a long-term restraining order. And by that time, the perpetrator is out of jail, and if he's not living with her, he may be just on the fringes of her life, and she's very frightened of him. And the thought of going back into court and confronting him, the abuser, is a very terrifying thing. And so oftentimes women don't follow through with a permanent restraining order. Again, the system gets down on her for that because she's not protecting herself or her children, and everybody outside her life says she's just setting herself up for more abuse, hurting herself. There's a reason for that. It's downright terrifying to confront the person who has abused you and who went to jail because of it. And finally, just a few slides about practice, policy, and prevention. There are a number of different interventions, treatment interventions that can be used for child neglect and psychological maltreatment cases. Probably the most effective are those multi-service interventions that's referred to here. They're ideal for neglectful families in particular because neglectful families tend to have a multi-problem nature of their need, many different kinds of problems, and so they need many different agencies involved. And the best model I've heard proposed to work with families that have chronic neglect issues is sort of a wraparound case management model where you have an individual who actually somebody who's going to hang around because they have to have a relationship with this parent, and that parent has to be able to depend upon them for a long time. And so one of the problems in social service agencies is people coming and going a lot. And so this is to be somebody who's pretty stable in the community and in the social service field, who is the coordinator of all the services for this neglectful or for this family that has all these needs. And unfortunately, it's a great model, but there aren't a lot of sources out there for funding a program like that. Home visitation programs where neglecting and at-risk parents have a mentor type counselor go to the home and work with them in terms of parenting and perhaps homemaking issues as well, but basically, self-esteem and all those kinds of things, just kind of help them orient their life and cope on a day-to-day basis more effectively. Different kinds of social support programs that decrease the isolation for adults and for children, like their boys and big brothers, big sisters, for instance, for children. For adults, oftentimes abused spouses don't have much of a social network at all because they've been kept at home, and so they're out there trying to do this on their own and stand up on their own 2 feet. They don't have anybody around them, and so the social support systems can be very useful and helpful for them in those situations. And then there are other early intervention programs, sort of where nurses, like for instance, go into the home and at the birth of a baby, when children or when individuals are identified as high risk for problems later in their marriage or in the child's development, nurses actually go out to the home right away and provide services and get them on track and help them get their baby, on the right developmental track. There are interventions for children who've been exposed to interpersonal or interparental violence, like group counseling, shelter programs when necessary, early education programs. But there are problems associated with those particular problems as are indicated here in this chart. A lack of correct implementation by workers, for instance, that's really talking about training. We don't, as a rule of thumb, understand domestic violence the way we need to understand it to work effectively with violent families. This is something that I hope to be able to accomplish for you in this class, is to be able to give you the information you need to be more effective, because there's an awful lot of people in our field that don't really understand the dynamics of domestic violence, and training is so important in this field. There are certainly policy issues as well, legal issues about parents' behavior. When does the state choose to intervene? Where does the limit of what a parent should be able to do end, where it's necessary for the state to step in and protect children? There is some movement afoot for child protection investigations to be done with more of a multidisciplinary team approach, rather than just having an individual investigator, social worker go out and get to know this family and find out what's going on, but also have legal consultations and some mental health consultations and medical consultations as well. This is a model that is being used now, and we'll talk about when we get into child sexual abuse, that is being used with child sexual abuse victims, in fact, the multidisciplinary approach through the child advocacy centers. AFSFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1997, changed some of the philosophies about child protection around the United States now, so that the focus in child protection agencies is not so much about child welfare as it is upon child safety. And so children are removed only for the reason of their own safety, or returned home when those safety threats are eliminated. If, however, the parents don't make adequate progress, then AFSFA also requires that the state move towards finding a permanent home for the child through termination of the parents' rights within a couple of years. There are safe haven laws. Most of the states around the United States, I guess, have this now, where parents can give up newborns anonymously in specific safe locations and have a full immunity. They can't be prosecuted for that. It's thought to be one way for, to prevent child abuse and neglect from developing. CAPTA in 2003 provided for the screening and developmental assessment of children who are in homes with substantiated abuse and neglect findings. Anytime we have a substantiated finding with a child under 3 years of age, we make a referral to the infant learning program through CAPTA, and that program goes out and even with involuntary families, and assesses the development of the children and tries to help those families catch early needs of the child. This is a program that actually helps us identify developmental issues among children in neglectful and abusive homes at an early age. And the hope is, of course, that parents can be engaged in working with individuals and create more positive interactions with children. Other policy issues involve poverty, and as we talked, as I think you read a little bit about last week, and we're going to read later on in the semester as well. Poverty. I'm sorry, you're reading this week, I think, that poverty really is very much woven into the whole issue with domestic violence and early childhood development and things like this. And it's an interesting fact that I think in the United States, the way our society is set up is we blame individuals for poverty. We say that, if you don't have enough money to get by, the general philosophy is in this nation right now, I think, sadly, is that, we really don't owe you a helping hand. And that's a very sad statement about our society, but I really truly believe that is the dominant philosophy these days. I do know that this is a philosophy that is sort of on a pendulum swing, and when it gets too far to the extreme, our centrist politicians tend to pull it back to the middle more, and eventually we begin to provide more services and put services in place to kind of so that individuals aren't really left out there all by themselves. But we really have a capitalist system in this nation that focuses upon individual achievement and profit. Money, the dollar, really is a sort of a philosophy that it's everybody for themselves. And successful people got there through their own efforts, and therefore, if you're not successful, it's your own fault, is sort of the way it's seen in this country. Most other nations around the world, even those that are allies and who have cultures similar to our own, see poverty as something very different and recognize that there are structural reasons for poverty in the way the society is built, the way it functions, that explain people being poor. And so those societies are more apt to provide programs that help those individuals. In Europe, when they talk about sort of a socialist system over there, it's really not socialism, but it is a system that recognizes a shared responsibility for the needs of everyone in society. Not such a bad idea. To me, it doesn't seem so radical, but in any event, that's another policy issue there is what do we do about poor families and neglect, and can we help them or not, and are we really willing to give them a helping hand? So in the end, one of the big questions, I guess, for you to think about is, who do we hold accountable for children's exposure to marital violence? And at this point, I think I'd say the answer is generally that while we recognize that the abuser is responsible for the harm that comes to children by observing domestic violence, we also place a lot of blame on the other parent for not acting to protect them when that other parent is really being victimized. And so, in the end, workers need to hold the violent person accountable rather than putting the blame on the victim. And there has been gains in collaboration between child protection agencies and women's shelter programs in that direction. And I think through continued collaboration, we're going to see more of a more effective response to helping both victims and children in violent families. This is the last slide. I will call, this is the end for this week. These two slides together will be the full lecture for week 4. If you have any questions about any of the material, please do contact me, and we'll I'll be happy to help you with it.